So anyone want to report their general experience drawing something that is not a face that you don't get to use your visual library for? What was that like for some of you?
I thought it was a bit nerve-wracking, but yeah, it was just kind of nerve-wracking but exciting at the same time. It was all quite new. Like I kind of
Yeah.
I've watched a lot of the videos and like to actually kind of I think you talk about the triangle
Hmm.
practice, and so there's the knowledge stuff, and so the actual practice part is what I'm actually doing it. Oh
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
scary but exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, if it's not scary, then it means that, the entire experience wasn't challenging enough or new enough. And if that's kind of how we gauge it, it is difficult. Art is difficult because one of the only kind of like artifacts we have are little, footprints that we have to prove that we're, somewhere and we can track something down is our fear, the fear factor. That if we're too comfortable, nothing is improving. It's just like not working out. If you're too comfortable, there's nothing, you're plateaued. So challenges like these, though they might be so out of your radar, so out of your interest, um, usually the things that you strive at, that you can really shine in, are the things that you haven't tried yet or don't know yet. You don't know what you're good at until you've tried it. You may imagine yourself as not being a very good storyteller, but as soon as you get into the rules of depth and have a background, middle ground, foreground, you enter this a whole new part of your brain that you didn't know you actually had a pretty high proficiency in like storytelling. So this is what I experienced the first time I tried doing a story. Through a couple of thumbnails of an illustration, I ended up realizing that I do have a good eye for how to guide the eye along, and I do have difficulty figuring out how much I should be rendering. I kind of freak out every time I get to the body of the creature or whatever it is. Anything that might signal to my brain, hey, you might start drawing a face soon, just let me know when you're ready and I'll open the dam for line dependency. And all of a sudden I'm like sketching and doing all this detail and I forget, oh my god, this is a whole illustration. I should be doing the entire thing zoomed out. It's no longer about the single character against an abstract background. It's about an entire world that came before the character did. So who here had that exact experience, finding themselves in that whirlpool of detail and character design where they were supposed to be focused on the illustration and the depth of the environment? So I can see a couple here where we do actually have these issues. Anyone have that kind of experience?
I don't really know what to experience because I've never done this stuff before.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been doing like characters, and I
Mm-hmm.
mean this is basically all new to me anyway because I stopped for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So at first it was like kind of scary,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was kind of cool because you get a lot of freedom when you're doing landscapes.
Yeah.
So the hardest part for me really was like composition.
Yeah.
I couldn't really get
And
it.
just the staging of all the units, like you've never had to take a director's perspective and set, okay, you go there, this tree goes here. When was the last time we thought about the placement of a tree?
Yeah.
So when it comes to illustration, environment illustration, what you have to think about is photography. That's the first unit. That's the first point of all of this. That's the number one note you write down today is think like a photographer. If you're not thinking like a photographer, you will think like an artist, which is not a good thing in this case because at this point where you are right now is not a professional that is aware of all of the rules of depth. Right now you are proficient in one unit. Maybe you're really good at faces and you're here to learn some other stuff. And so that one really, really good at faces talent that you have is constantly asking to be employed. And so because you are in a student position, you will be finding areas where you are comfortable and then you will start to over render those areas. So you may have a really, really good idea of what the gesture is doing, but the entire environment is flat, which is an example of what I'm seeing here in front of me. So
Yeah.
the character is a really, really great illustration, a real gesture. I really see the struggle in pulling that heavy thing, but everything else seems like it's floating in its own universe, and you're no longer marrying everything together as a singular texture, as with the rules of depth. Perspective might be also have thrown you for a kind of like a kind of a hard ball. I think this is Scott's, and at this point where you are right now is not thinking like a photographer. You're not taking a picture. You're putting things beside each other, which can be very, very good unit. It can be a very good unit of design if you're designing for children. So children's illustrations don't like, publishers don't like seeing the hyperrealism. They like seeing things that look like those pop-up books or clip art or stuff that is very easily staged, because that stuff creates a more symbolic remembrance of the object versus the more representational remembrance of the object. So some of these are actually really, really successful. This is an example of like a wonderful way to stage for a children's novel. But considering that you went full realism in the proportion of the body, you've kind of thrown us off again. Is the style unified? So when it comes to unifying the style, combining that with photography and staging, you end up having a little bit of everything, and that's what kind of destroys the mood and the atmosphere of an illustration, of an environment. So one of the, after photography, when you think about staging, all right, I've set the stage, I have a good division of all of these, I know where the horizon is, division of all the units on the horizon as the stage. How am I going to move forward after that? So after photography, you think about the audience that you're aiming for, the core audience that you're aiming for. If it's a more storybook, stylized, cartooned, anime, you think about using more large, bold shapes. You don't use complete, pure anatomy. After the large, bold shapes, what follows is just understanding the story, just the story that you're trying to tell, making sure that it's easy to read. So this story here is not particularly easy to identify. So we want something that is a little bit more straight to the point. The more simple you are with the general story, the more you can kind of bend it a little bit and make it more intricate as you go. So the general story is a lost creature. The creature is hiding, watching him, about to catch the prey or catch the dragon. I'm confused as who's catching who. Do you want to kind of tell us about this a little bit, Scott?
Yeah.
Sure.
I wanted the idea of someone trying to, they lost their dragon or creature, and they have this giant comically oversized collar, like, here, boy, come here. And it's this, like, dangerous, vicious thing that's already killed this deer. He's like, I see the deer, I know you're there, come on, like, it's time to go home.
I see, yeah. Right now what I see is that the dragon has laid the trap, and this character is looking for the dragon and trying to catch him, and what was lost is the deer. So this is how I'm reading it, because the way you've set this up is the dragon is the antagonist. The dragon is the danger, because we had two pitches, two really, really defined pitches for the homework. So let me find them for you. One of them was, I know you're there. The second was, shh, I hear something. And the last one is, someone is watching us. So there are very, very specific pitches. It can just say, someone is watching me. You can alter it like that a little bit. But I feel like he's laid the trap for him. So a better way to salvage some of these illustrations is to just try to kind of change some things. So instead of making him catch this character, what would happen is I would get rid of the collar and encourage this as just a singular traveler, or a group of travelers who find a dead carcass somewhere and wonder what the heck is going on, and he's just laying the trap for them. This is more of a simplified story. The more complicated the story, the more complication you have, that the capacity of a thumbnail, it wouldn't be able to maintain all that complication. This would require a book to be written for it to maintain all the detail required and deliver that detail to the reader. You only have so little time in a thumbnail that will eventually become a full, beautiful illustration. In a thumbnail, you have only so much time to determine the story and to tell the story. So something more simplified helps you stage easier. A simple story that's simple doesn't mean boring. Simple is actually encouraged in illustration and staging, because you speak more with the open space that you have. And by open space, I don't mean space between the objects. I mean making it easier for the audience to read the story. So if this was set up in such a way where it was, do you remember in Up when they were trying to catch the creature Kevin, and before whatever it is, the snark or something, I don't know what it's called, they delivered him at first in the thumbnails, in the original thumbnails, I guess, with storyboarding, when they were thinking about introducing Kevin, they introduced him as a very large force, larger than the boy. kind of like twisting and turning behind him, blurry in the distance. So that's kind of what I would go for if it was a missing pet that's way too large, that's larger than life, but is also very playful. You could have also added the carcass and the trap and all of that, but delivered it in a way that you can know for sure the audience will read it as a missing pet or a missing loved one. So this is another thing that I want you guys to note down, and I've talked about this before. You can shamelessly copy storyboarding and framing and staging and photography and camera work and cinematography. You can shamelessly copy that in cinema because there's only so much of that to be used, that there's no one way of people copy all the time. People copy the greats and classics. People copy all kinds of horizon line placements, all kinds of close-ups, all kinds of scale, and it's just so many that you see repeated through cinema. And I'll try to find the documentary I found and link it so that you guys can watch it after class. It's really a wonderful resource, just watching movies, things like where you do have pets that are slowly, or animals that will become pets that are slowly emerged in the story, that are introduced in the story to enhance their mystery and power. So in How to Train Your Dragon, the first time we see Toothless, and the way he's introduced, the way that they introduce him with the sharper eye before enlarging his eye and making him look like a cat. So he has that really, really thin pupil. And again, that's another way to deliver him, so that the story mode is in defense, is in the pitches that we originally were working with. So someone is watching us kind of describes a vision of some kind of danger, and I would assume that it would be a lot more clear if the danger would be a lot more clear and be closer to the pitch if the character was just wandering, if the character knew they were being watched. And maybe you can get rid of the lost sign and just leave behind a couple footprints that the character has tracked, and they see the carcass and they're about to get, and they know exactly who they're finding. Maybe it's a tracker who knows the dragon is watching them. So this would seem a little bit more accurate a story. So I would encourage you to go back to the story and edit it a little bit so that it matches. One day you'll be in a working environment where your skills will be called on to describe a pitch in a storyboard frame or two, and you'll have to create this exact feeling. You can't alter it to match what you think is some of your best, your strength. Your strengths were obviously gestures, and compared to everything else, your gesture is really advanced. It felt like he was really hauling something. But that doesn't mean you can change the story to sync it in with your skill level. Try the thing that is scary, and staging is really, really a wonderful thing to add to any kind of illustration. Even if it's a portrait that is close up, there is a lot of staging to be done there, in the way that you describe with a gesture, and the way you describe an emotion through an expression and all of that. There's still a lot of storytelling to be done. So what I'll be looking for is photography, syncing of style, prioritizing the story, the simplicity of the story. And another really, really big thing that helps you tell a story in an illustration is the lighting. The lighting is a very, very big, wonderful way to tell a mood in a story. The lighting is the only way really to tell a mood. You can describe a lot of a mood with a really, really low camera, with the trees towering over. The character feels small, so the viewer feels small. Something that, whereas, Frodo walking into Lothlorien for the first time, which is this beautiful elven forest, kind of scary but beautiful. So you would make all the trees unusually large and him so small. So that would be one way to tell a story. But if it's dim and you have slight little hiccups of light all around the environment, these are all wonderful ways to enhance the scene. More darkness than light to enhance the danger, but still bringing in those little hiccups of light to enhance the beauty. And a low camera at that, everything works and so beautifully together and is synced, telling the same story. So the story may be simple, but the fundamentals you use to approach the story are actually very, very complicated. Light alone has so much, you have so much responsibility to keep the light consistent, that you have to have the story simple. There's too many fundamentals to manage, to caretake, that if you were to have a complicated story, it would not be an easy time for you to maintain it. So ask any environment artist. One of the biggest piece of information I take back from interviews is keep the story simple. Keep the character simple. Keep the character easy to animate. Keep the character easy to describe. Don't make them too complicated. Don't make them have fire powers and they can disappear and they can also fly. That's ridiculous because it's no longer relatable. The story becomes very difficult for the viewer to access. So camera and making sure that the camera is low, the photography is low, framing with a low angle, it would have kind of salvaged the story here. So this person, this character, is stalking this character here. This animal is stalking the character. And right now it does not feel like that. What it feels like, what the initial read is, and I'm sure a lot of you are reading this as well, is it feels like it's her pet following her. She seems very stable. She doesn't seem like she's on guard. Remember, these pitches show that the initial character behind this background, this whole, like the background, the character is aware that they're being watched. So all of these are from a common theme. I know you're there. I hear something. Something is watching us. The character is aware. And what I was looking for was a more kind of subtle way of describing through the gesture that the character is cautious, maybe arms out, legs bent, haunched forward, kind of listening like a tracker. That would have been something a little bit more close to the pitch that we had. Any one of those, the character has to have that kind of position. So we have a really leveled angle in the camera. What that shows is safety. You'll see all those, I mean, you never have low cameras or high cameras in like a romantic comedy story or something like that. Everyone is safe, everyone's okay, everyone lives in New York and is really happy. But when we're talking about fantasy stories, which is why I say try to focus on a more fantasy realm, because everything goes in a fantasy realm. You can mess around with the camera angle to push the fantasy and the dangers that we don't usually face day to day. So that means the camera can be low. It's a dog-eat-dog world in a world of fantasy. So you don't have safety. You don't have those kind of like too many breaks. You have more plight than you have rest. So these are all moments of plight, and a good writer in fantasy understands the plight rest pattern. You can see that in all kinds of movies. There's always rest, and then there's something big happens, and then they rest again. Something big happens, they travel, and then you can find this in the Lord of the Rings as well. So I'm not describing a resting scene. A resting scene, which is something you can write down now as part of your tools you can call on later, which I hope you're applying to all the corrections, and I encourage you to try these corrections. A rest scene has a leveled horizon line. So far we've talked about the camera angle in photography, and a good camera angle encourages the atmosphere and the mood. The style and the bold shapes all encourage the mood and the aim for the audience. And then there's the fact that a safe camera angle is going to encourage this other kind of story. It's going to, so your story was written in a way where it was supposed to be dangerous, but from what I'm looking at, that's just her pet following her. So this is what you would do for a children's novel. You don't want to create too much danger. You don't want to scare the child. So they don't like having those kinds of kind of like too much happening, too much danger, too real a danger in the story. So that's where you can continue indefinitely, always using really, really friendly level cameras. A high angle camera isn't as scary as a low angle camera. So if a character is too small, the world's very big around them, it's scary. But if a character is in a tree looking down, a high angle camera can be playful, can be fun. It can be dangerous if the character in the foreground is visible and is holding some kind of weapon. So you can invest danger in a high angle camera. So that means a character in a tree looking down. But that can also be very fun as well if the character isn't necessarily, it's like some sort of monkey character that's a little bit playful but a little bit dangerous at the same time. You can have them in a high angle camera. But in the perspective of the victim, which is why I specifically added that a victim should be or the potential victim or the person that is being hunted is the perspective that I wrote the pitches from. I know you're there, I hear something is watching us. They are the victim. So the low angle camera with the character in the foreground with a really, really cautious angle, a cautious gesture with a bit of an angle in the lighting that maybe reflects the light up at them the way a fireplace would, just upward, so they're having that really, really eerie long shadows on the face, always in danger. And you don't have to do much work to make the danger happen in the painting. This could have been very, very simply a set of trees. The character is low angle. The trees are all towering above them. The character is there, all cautious, kind of their hands are out. Maybe they have a spear, and then they have a couple of other characters beneath them. This would be the framing. The camera is really low, so that means we only see a couple pieces of grass on the bottom. And just out here, there's like a big kind of like silhouette, maybe it's some sort of snake, and just two eyes. You don't have to do much at the end to describe the danger if you did it all already with the cinematics and the gesture and the angle and the lighting. So this could have been a fireplace. Suddenly, you know, they were all resting, and you know, you know, suddenly something snuck up on them and they heard a twig snap. So this character could have been looking up. Very, very simple story. It's a very simple story. People get hunted while they're in a safe fire, sitting around a fire. But you don't have to end up dealing with depending too much on your ability to paint a portrait. And this is why I say it's all a zoom out game. It's all zooming out. It's all about having a simple story that you deliver through a really, really precise balance, a really kind of like a tug of war between all the units of depth, all the units of cinema and presentation, staging and lighting. It's all about that. It's no longer about the portrait, which is why it's such a hardball. When is the next time we're really going to draw an illustration and think about all of this? And I don't want you to be artists that only draw a pretty face with a couple of scars and you make it an original character and that's it. That's it for your portfolio. I want you guys to be artists that can deliver this kind of storytelling power in your portfolios. So I do encourage you to go back after today's session and apply all these units that you're writing down, because it won't be you won't really see the benefit of this until you actually apply it to your story, and you'll see, wow, this is a lot easier for me to tell the story now. I don't have to worry so much about the character. I can really spend my time with the photograph, with the camera, and employing your role as the photographer is going to answer a lot of questions about what needs rendering and what doesn't. That overlaid with the rules of depth, you also realize I don't need to render. I mean, the render of the fox or wolf is not that high. I feel like it's just, it's just an experimental thumbnail anyways, but you don't have to, even though it is the story, it's the whole point of the entire illustration that something is watching them, you don't actually have to render the thing that's watching them, or them for that matter. It's what you actually rendered is already there in the 3-point perspective fade of the trees in low angle, and the low camera and the lighting. Really, that's all you really ever had to worry about. You've never worked in this order before. It was always character first, eyeball first, iris first, lash first, and then eventually the story fell in because you decided to add a story. Now it's backwards, story first. And working between these two extremes in the spectrum is exactly what some of you need here. You've discovered also whether or not form studies are required in your off-hours study. So a lot of you haven't captured the most essential cubes, the most essential size of the cube, the most obvious and glaring lighting scenarios. This is one entire silhouette set up with rules of depth kind of thrown out. The trees in the foreground are the same values as the trees in the background, which is very problematic. So a lot of the time, form studies, studies altogether, kind of disguised as illustrations or masterpieces, which is basically what a thumbnail illustration for an environment is, reveals to us what we have left. Because if at this stage you've already designed her little feet, her hood, and his eyes, by now you should have included some of the cube, some of the leftovers of the cube, anything, any side of the cubes, basically, if the light was coming from one angle, if it wasn't a silhouette, so one part of the tree would be just in shadow. So that's missing. One really, really important shadow for the tree. Of course, I don't encourage this kind of lighting. It's very safe. And plus, the position of the horizon line is also extremely safe. A silhouette, so let's talk about what's safe and what's not safe in lighting. Obviously, low angle lighting, anything where someone has a flashlight under their face, is really, really scary lighting, because we're used to seeing the light from above, the sun from above. We're used to seeing shadows move downward. When we distort the shadow and have it below the face, that creates a danger, distorts faces, therefore makes it more of a scary environment in anything, including a portrait. Any kind of silhouette where the character is hooded or in some kind of no detail, you only see the kind of large, scary silhouette of an impending danger, maybe a guy with a hat, kind of crouched, no visibility in his neck isn't visible. He has a very, very long coat. You can't tell where his arms start, where his arms end. Some of the scariest Slender Man kind of stuff that I've seen is just a state, anything in silhouette. This is more scary than the light coming in from the side where we can see anything from the side. We can see the side of his face and all that. He no longer becomes scary, just dangerous, which is a very fine balance. So ask yourself, how am I going to deliver this danger or this scary or this, if the character is cool or if the character is very agitated, how am I going to tell that through the lighting? So now you have lighting as a way to enhance the story and the character and enhance danger in a story or safety in a story. The position of the horizon line as a way to enhance danger or safety. And then of course the staging and the style. If you're going for something that is more, and this is what I mean by bold shapes, if you're going for something that's more deliberately scary, it's not meant for a young audience. It's a really cool side-scroller game. There is a side-scroller game that actually looks just like this. It's like a silhouette of a character. I forget what it's called. But it's all just silhouette, and it's really eerie, and the character dies really quickly. It's a really, really hard game to play, but the reason why it's so scary is because there's so many sharp shapes. There's so many triangular shapes. So one thing you did have really, really well is this triangular shape right here. It feels very scary. That's why there is some danger left behind. He does look like he's prowling. He does look like he's ready to hunt. He's kind of traveling in a straight line. Legs kind of bent to the floor, kind of really ready to hunt, ready to pounce. The tail is behind him looking like a fox. The ears are low. So you did manage to get a lot in the gesture, but we've talked about how gesture is almost tertiary when you're thinking about what you're prioritizing in your story. But you did have this wonderful sharp shape, this silhouette, this little trend of trend shape here that creates the feeling of danger. So stay away from round shapes, or encourage round shapes. Encourage them for a safe feeling, which is when we have a more balanced horizon line, and use sharper shapes when you're dealing with more of a dangerous setup, so a low camera angle with sharper shapes. So that character that I drew in the background, those guys around the fireplace, the character that requires very little rendering, just a simple silhouette, could have not been a very rounded, friendly looking snake. It could have been something very jagged. And this is where you get to play a lot and have fun a lot with your characterization. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be boring in that way. You have all kinds of fun shapes that can really create the feeling of danger. You have pyramids, triangles, you have straight lines, you have a cube. Anything with points to it creates or reminds the character of teeth or claws or weapons. And all weapons have some kind of sharpness to them, some kind of triangular point to them, and that's what you want to encourage in your illustration. It could have been some really, really long winged kind of like daggered character all the way at the front, and that one character in the foreground could have just seen him for a second. You could have hidden him in some kind of shrubbery or branches. It's very hard to tell. The reason why that Slender Man kind of like silhouette, low camera, high, very tall Slender Man looking down or in the distance, it's kind of like a Where's Waldo situation. He camouflages in the environment, and that's why he's so scary. So when we're talking about this pitch particularly, we're focusing on the scary, but try to imagine a pitch that is half scary, half dangerous, partly dangerous. When they're delivered, of course it was for a children an audience, so when they delivered the image of Toothless in How to Train Your Dragon, they didn't try to go this way. This would have been too scary for them. They went for more, just slowly kind of like coming up, what's his name? Fish Legs? I forget the main character's name. Hiccup? Yeah, he slowly emerges from behind the rock and sees him kind of just laying there. We don't see his face. It's kind of adding some mystery. And then we eventually see the character, but he's obviously not with the friendly eyes. He has his teeth out. Eventually, when he gets to know him, when he's stuck in that little canyon, he becomes more friendly and cat-like. So you just have to think about the direct audience and how much danger to include, your main audience, your goal audience, how much danger to include, and in knowing how much danger to include, you'll know how much of fear factor you have to have. You'll know where to place your camera. You'll know what to do with your light. You know how to arrange your shapes, and that's it. That's really it. It's not that complicated. It's relatively easy because you're not dealing with all the annoying, stressful, excessive rendering of anatomy and portraiture and all of that. It doesn't have to be about the portrait. A couple of brushstrokes and you can get a read for lips and cheekbones. It's never been about that. You don't have to go full throttle on any kind of detailing when it comes to gesture. Keep the story simple, because the more simple the story, the easier it will be for you to access all these rules without too much damage to the story, because you have to sync all of these together. You have to sync the horizon line with the lighting, and that's a lot to take care of if the story is really complicated. The best scenes in history and animated cinema or anything are the simple ones, the ones that just had a singular character and one guy staring him down. The characters that had, let me imagine my favorite scene from one of my favorite movies. You probably know already because I talk about it a lot. In that one movie, I can't believe I forgot what it's called, but it's Kung Fu Panda, but the guy, I forget what his name is, Tai Lung. It's when you see him, jail. When you see him for the first time, he's extremely mysterious, just simply drawn. It's not the most crazy lighting scene in the story. You have some amazing scenes in here. But when they first see him, when that duck comes into the prison for the first time, it's a very eerie scene that's very high above. So this is why I describe danger. In this case, the danger is on the ground. So when he looked down the first time on this platform, which is like a full, I'm not sure how many feet down, but it's definitely very, very far from the character in the foreground. And then you just see very, very simple character. A jail, a bad guy, and please don't let him out. And that's exactly what happens. Really, really simple stuff. It doesn't have to be complicated. Of course, the fight scene is complicated. That's where choreography and cinema comes in. That's a whole other ball game. All you have to worry about are the stills. That's what they're going to give you. That's the job they're going to give you. Make this still look like it's the best, because it's going to be a full 5 seconds of panning on this one scene. It has to look amazing. The other 2-second scenes, they don't bother rendering those with the highest amount of lighting and texture. They don't really worry about that because it's like a split-second scene in the movie. What you would be as the concept artist, as the environment artist, you would be in charge of those 10-second scenes, those long distance shots, those establishing shots of environments like a castle or something like that. So Kung Fu Panda Valley. These are the shots that really count. This is actually one really, really beautiful shot where Tai Lung had just escaped from the scene, from the jail, and his shadow, they kind of superseded it on the valley, on the picture of the valley. And this is his shadow on it. Very, very simple, impending doom, simple cast shadow, high angle, but they managed to make it scary and transition so beautifully. This is the kind of stuff that is what a thumbnail does. Really, really simple, but you see all the rounded edges, all the rounded shapes, all the shape language is actually very safe, very fun, and his shape is very long and triangular. Nothing about it seems fun. Everything seems very, very dangerous. And this is your shape language. A high angle kind of feels safe, but not really. This is a really, really high angle. Feels like everything is so much bigger than this tiny little town that has a shadow on it that is so much larger than it is. We're just describing more. We're telling stories with symbols and language, the right kind of symbol. There's also another scene where, it's actually a fighting scene, so it might not be relevant, but it's just this beautiful scene where they're all fighting, but it's a moment they see him between this extended bridge, and the bridge has like little breaks in it. There's also the moment when Po sees for the first time the stairs, and now he has to climb the stairs, and they use excessive, exaggerated atmospheric fade to make it seem so far away for this, big, burly, fat guy to climb them. So they made it even more daunting, and they used that kind of vertigo lens and that transition, and they made it even more scary to show that he had such a difficult time. And then they give that sequence where he's climbing forever, and he only made 2 steps or so. So this is the kind of stuff where we go to research, where we enrich our visual library with examples of stories that needed telling, but only has so many. Of course it's an animated film, but at one point this was a storyboard that inspired it to become animated, that led it to have a really stable foundation once it was animated. They don't animate as they go. They have a really solid storyboard set up first. And these are the stills in those storyboards that that anchors the entire movie. So when we're talking about danger, we're talking about all of this stuff used together. So I'm going to use all of these units to lead into the critique of some of these. But we're going to start first with some really quick notes from the past that I have. I'm always referring to this one here about the rules of depth. I believe I've covered these with you guys already. And then I'm going to talk about the presence of white in a painting, and how some of you guys did go for the black and white, but your use of white is actually excessive. So to start off, does anyone have any questions first though? Does anyone have anything to say at all? No? No questions? Okay. When we're talking about the use of white, white is a particularly dangerous half of contrast to employ in a painting. It's dangerous because what happens is white is less abundant than black in nature. So we have more darkness than we have white. And pure white in a painting means a light source. So we never really have white unless it's a glaring light source. So in some of these, we actually have too much white telling the story. So white here is great because it was inspired by some of that stuff I was showing earlier. But white use here is actually making it feel like more of a distant dream or some kind of like Twilight Zone or something like that. It doesn't feel like a dangerous Shelob kind of spider, you know, kind of lurking in the distance. It's very well done, but it feels like he's seen the spider already. The story isn't concrete. The story isn't being told. It just looks like a guy versus monster, and that's it. There's a story we're telling. How do we tell the story? That the spider is watching him. If we've exposed it all in lighting, if the horizon line is safe, and the character has an expression on them through their gesture that isn't really, it's more of an exclaiming expression than one of caution and, you know, is there danger? Is there a possibility of danger? Is this thing going to pounce? Is it just watching us? So that's the kind of tension you want to create, and there's no tension when we've seen the monster and we've seen the character and it's a nice flat stage and it's easy to ingest. It shouldn't be easy to ingest. It should be take a little bit more time to observe. It should keep the person watching, waiting for something to happen. But it's just a still painting. That's how you get the best read, the most intriguing pull from the audience, is if you show less. And by using white like this so abundantly, you show too much, along with, of course, the lighting setup altogether, this really diffused, glowy, foggy light, and the safe horizon line, and both characters aligned perfectly in the middle of the canvas. So usually what we like to do is think about dividing in such a way where we choose one part of the canvas to be the most intriguing, but we do not invest anything of intrigue or any POI, a point of interest, on the outside of the canvas. So we have the characters actually existing in space number 1 and number 2, really awkward symmetrical placement, and all of this negative space that you could have used for storytelling. So to improve this, what I would have done is, instead of using so much white, of course, I would have had a little bit of a rock here, probably a lower camera, even if it was just a higher camera. If it was a high camera, let's say there's a canyon somewhere here, the character is kind of just walking, kind of really cautious again. He's just thinking. There's more rocks behind him. And then all of this is drowning in light and shadow, sorry. There's a very simple path for the eye to follow. Somehow, in the little break of the path, there's a little canyon or a walkway, and then we see this massive circular object and all these legs slightly visible, not a full silhouette, and a couple of eyes kind of just sneaking in. The character's just walking through a canyon or even a cave, and we show the stalagmites, kind of, stalactites, sorry, kind of above him. And we don't see his face because everything is right above him, and he's kind of like holding his spear and just walking. We see these really kind of like really close to him. And these eyes. And if you were going for something foggy, you could have had some fog just hanging around. It didn't have to be one big gray canvas. You could have had fog as a line of sight guide. You could have created some beautiful lines, composition lines, to kind of encase around the character to make him feel like he's about to get trapped, he's about to get eaten, and the fog is about to encase him, kind of as a foreshadowing of his impending doom. And that would be the spider here that's hiding ever so slightly visible. Okay, so that's how we're kind of telling the story. He could have had a little torch as well. This could have been the light visible in the eyes of the spider, and in the little pincers, and the kind of some of the texture or the hair on its surface, some scary, like growy goo stuff of somewhere hanging around. Maybe there were skeletons that he would eventually discover. Maybe there are skeletons all around him. But this is how we tell. At this point, the fact that the character looks so tiny and everything is so large around him, and the fog is slowly encircling around him, makes him feel small. So in this case, a high angle camera actually makes him feel very, very small, as much as a low angle camera, just as long as there are units outside to encourage this kind of storytelling. So don't use an abundance of white. Again, another example of this. White isn't easily accessible in the real world. White only exists when at the highest point of the day, and if it's reflective enough, and if it's the right kind of texture, and even if the highest point of the day casts some pretty long shadows, and if it's really beautiful blue sky, it's going to be a really happy scene. Why would we deliver a scary scene of, I know you're there, I hear something, something is watching us, in a really brightly lit scene? Why would we have beautiful elvish green leaves all hanging around and golden sunshine sparkling through? That's a rest. That's between plight and another plight. To have a plight, you have to signal those things with your camera use and your light use. This does not feel plight. It just feels like really, really simple placement, stage placement, and does not feel dangerous. The story is very difficult to understand. So if this thing was watching them, I would not show a mountain range. I don't want to show it as a colossus. If it's a big creature, it's not stalking anybody. Everybody can see it. To create a stalker is to close the space around us. You're showing a mountain range. We've talked about a mountain range before in my public class, the conversation with the dragon challenge. So this would be the dragon, and this would be the mountain range, and this would be the dragon kind of, there was a whole other unit of making the dragon look larger than life. I would crop it somewhere here so the dragon takes up more space in the canvas, and I'd make the character kind of like leaning against a canyon or something like that, or a cliff, and he's kind of like, stay away from me or whatever, and then he ends up intriguing the dragon to not kill him by having a good conversation with him. So this was one of our challenges where you are allowed to have mountain ranges, you are allowed to kind of explore a little bit, but of course the canvas needs to be closed off. But you're not creating the feeling of suspense, closed off, danger, high or low camera, intriguing camera period, if it's one, a leveled camera scene, and a mountain range with sky visible. I mean, these guys seem like they are voluntarily there. They don't feel like they're about to be trapped or about to get lost or about to kind of enter this doom where they could possibly die, or this might be the climax or the story that finally found the creature they're looking for, and it's been following them the whole time. That's wonderful but simple storytelling. Here it does not make sense to me. So this guy is riding a beast. I'm not sure who to be scared of, but how am I supposed to be scared of him if he looks so small and ridiculous in the distance? He does not look scary to me. If he was riding it, we wouldn't see him. He'd kind of be there hidden, whispering away at it. Maybe at the point of meeting, finally, when the dragon is kind of close to these two guys, and we looked upon the dragon and we saw that upon it there was a person who was riding it the whole time, maybe like sitting in such a funny way. Maybe he's some sort of really ridiculous character. Maybe he's a dragon tamer. Maybe he is an evil creature, an antagonist altogether. But he's not significant enough. If we were to see a mountain range, we'd still see him. He must be colossal, like a giant. So that's not good storytelling, because what you've done here is you've tried to do too much and you've used none of the rules. So it's okay now that, of course, you've known them, you've discovered them, but there should have been some kind of instinct that did not make it feel dangerous. If you're not scared of your own drawing, something's not right. If you're aiming for danger and you don't feel danger, you as the artist, you can't say, oh, I won't feel it, but my audience will. Oh, I don't feel it now because I'm the artist. No, trust me, you'll feel the danger, you'll feel the suspense, you'll feel that kind of stare down, that kind of romantic stare down almost between the character and the the other character or the story. So what I mean by romantic is, there's a really, really old one, but I feel like it's one of the ones where I illustrated the best. Very, very old painting of mine. So this is one of them here. Very, very old, but I kind of tried to employ that use of abundant black with subtle whites. But one of the pieces, I'm not sure if I have it here, right here. So this piece right here, very, very old, I apologize, but the point of it was romance. And what I wanted was that romantic scene. So she was in the foreground, she wasn't dark, she was dangerous. This is why I used some of the shape language, but I kind of tried to maintain the beauty in her just her silhouette, very beautiful, curvy, tall, and the character in the distance, very manly, large shoulders, and that's it's kind of like a common theme that I have, this character. Again, more romance here, but she doesn't know he's there. So what I go for is romance and danger a little bit, which is why the camera is so low. He shows an impending doom for her. She's an impending doom for him because of the danger they apply. The cast shadow coming off the rock is how I used his position as a way to create danger for her, who is that dangerous intruder, and him, who is that dangerous character over there in the rocks, because of her position, which is very cautious, again, kind of crouching forward, ready to pounce, kind of just like a hunter, a feral hunter. So this is what I mean by that romance. Not always romance as in like a romantic, but like more of a high emotion value in what you're painting. Some of these are a little bit older and weaker, but I try to kind of push that exact feeling. So the one that I gave you guys as well as an example is also another example of the way I invest romance in the way I'm telling the story, but still kind of keep the camera angle not dangerous, not high towering trees, but just low enough on the horizon line that it doesn't feel quite safe. It's not safe as a middle ground or like a helicopter. When you're third person omniscient, that's when you're in like a helicopter camera angle where the horizon line is pretty middle or high middle, to show that the characters in the air, they're like in God mode, they're not even part of the story, they're just watching it happen. Those are the weakest kind of framing, in my opinion, when it comes to cinema. If I see anything like that, I don't feel in danger, I don't feel scared. In Mad Max, you'll notice all of the camera angles are from the ground level, because that's how you maintain the audience, that's how you keep the audience on their feet. That movie was like a masterpiece. It felt so dangerous, and that's the only way they managed to make those dust clouds feel dangerous and like impending doom, but making everything larger than life by keeping all the characters on the ground. So I kept him a little bit on the ground, and of course it's more romance than danger, but the I know you're there is still there, of course. So I kept it more dangerous, more romantic than more like fear factor dangerous or thriller dangerous. So when everything is so leveled, it also has that awkward feeling in it. So you should notice the fear, you should notice the romance, you should kind of believe in your own story. I know you're playing all the tricks and you're the magician, but you should really be like kind of a sucker for your own story. You should really be picking up on some of the signals, and it does feel awkward, and everything is so just so visible, so available for the audience. So we move on to this one. I really like the long cast shadows. I like how it's hard to tell where the characters are now that we've talked about the presence of the light, because if the light over here has cast a cast shadow silhouette on this, we don't really notice the elf in the foreground, which some of you might not have noticed. This is the guy that's watching in the foreground. So it is high angle. There is a character here that's approaching the diamond. He seems to be a guardian of some kind. I would give a little bit more of a silhouette of this guardian. I would try to describe what he's doing. It's more about the guardian watching this happen than about the character in this particular still. And you seem to be doing way more for the environment and making things way too complicated. Just like in general, it feels like we're in outer space or in some kind of observation, like telescope or something like that, something scientific, or ruins of something, which is good, but the perspective is a little bit off considering the inside of the hollow. And the character here, this is all darker than him. Characters in the foreground have to be darker than characters in the background. So to create depth, we overlap, we push things up along the horizon, we scale, we shrink things in the distance. So you had all of that. But characters in the foreground have to be a little bit more black, have to have a bit more contrast to them. This brightness is way too bright, way too accessible, so your use of white here is actually a little bit, for lack of a better word, this is what I say when when artists use too much white. I think it's cheesy and awkward. because you're just giving off too much. You're telling too much of the story. It's like someone's playing a trick of lights in a dark room, and someone just turns on the light and all the magic is gone. It's like really stupid. Or you're part of a seance and it's like a dark room, and you paid $100 to be a part of the seance, which actually happened to a friend of mine, and someone just turns on the light and it's just a guy in the background kind of rattling some stuff. And it was just hilarious, because that's exactly what's happening in this type of illustration. You turn on all the lights, everything is visible, nothing is mysterious. So the less light you use, the more you can mess around with the rules of depth. So one, it disrupts the read. So when you have too much white in the room, when you have too much white in here, what happens is that the disruption of the read means that what are we looking at anyways? It's not the diamond, it's the character about to get the diamond. It was never about the diamond. This is just a secondary object. It was not about that. It was about the journey of the character. So it's disrupted the read, making it the most important part of the painting. What you have to do is remember that the edges here are being combined with the pure white. When we have pure white, when we're combining it with an edge, we have pure focal point. If you wanted him to have a focal point, you could have made this white, but just fuzzed it out just a little bit, just a little bit, and that would have been enough to kind of create the feeling of like an illumination or a glow. And that doesn't mean that it's now the focal point. It's just glowing for the purpose of it being a point of interest, but it's not the only point of interest. The 2 points of interest is a relationship between this as the hunter watching him and this guy who is kind of just standing there. I would have loved to see you spend more time on the gesture than on this rock and environment building. This was not important. It's beautiful, but it's not important right now. There's a relationship between him, where he's looking, us following him, looking at this, not staying here too long because it's not so super bright. We go back down and we look at him. We can keep looking at this moment of suspense that something is about to happen. And yeah, light source is supposed to be weak, and when we're rendering, we try to keep all the rendering power to the most important part of the painting. So if there was white on this character, if he had a horse or something that had a bit of a more like a decorated sword or a decorated armor, we try to cheat in some excess white there just to enhance him as the focal point. So be careful with your use of white. Don't let it be too cheesy. Don't let it be too out there, and try to keep more abundance in the shadow so that the light really does play a role. Does anyone have any questions at all so far? No? Okay. So
I have a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
If you wanted to use fire or something like that for a storytelling point, how would you incorporate that without it being like an overpowering light source?
So what we would see, typically a fire is not bright enough to be like a super white, so we would never use super white on it. Also, if this was a movie, I would never allow the camera to aim at the fire. I would never allow the camera to be in the fire, for the fire to be in the frame. So you can see this in anything really. If you look at movies, you'll find that the fire is not filmed, it's just slightly off camera. So if for some reason the character has to hold the flame, if this is necessary, then you will just do what you have to do and use the no man's land value. However, it's not a laser, it's not a beam, it's just a simple, cool fire. A fire is actually pretty cool for a flame. It's very candle-like, it has very sharp shadows. Right at the start, but everything else gets pretty weak towards it. It has a very small radius, so I would be allowing it to get into no man's land whites. I would look for any nearby metallic objects on the character who's holding it or near it, and I would allow them to spike into white just so that we can share. But at that moment, when the character is near a fire or is holding a fire, they share the focal point. If this is a close-up of a portrait, why is there a fire in there? It's never a good idea. If the fire is in there, you dim that fire. It makes no sense, but you gotta smoke it out a little bit. You gotta make it a bit more of a smoky, dying flame than a full-on, realized no man's land value flame. So if for some reason it's a portrait and a close-up and the flame is right beside the character, you have to film it with it. But almost always look out for it. Next time you watch a movie, the fire is deliberately off screen. But if it is for some reason, it shares the focal point. Over here in these pieces, there's really no rhyme or reason going on. There's just really everything is the same level, no rules of depth. The canyon isn't black enough to be a canyon. I don't understand the story. Someone is watching them, but it doesn't look like they know. It doesn't look like they're aware. I think you aimed a little bit high. Again, this is an example of a complicated story. It's not a story where the story started off simple and then you use the rules and fundamentals to enhance it. This is more complicated. This is more of a comic book. It should have been more drawn. It should have been more of a, less of an illustration and more of a kind of a scripted kind of scene between two characters, and you have that one guy in the background watching them. He's about to do something and they don't know it. I don't feel like they know it. I don't feel like he's in a dangerous position. I feel like the story is through his perspective, not theirs. If it was through their perspective, then they could have, you know, a couple panels before this explain that yes, someone is watching them right now, a whole league of people about to ambush them, and they know it or something like that. But why do I paint something that requires a preface in order for the, you know, for the viewer to understand this? You should be able to tell the entire story in one frame. Okay, so we'll move on to this one. This one might be promising. You might be able to kind of just keep this exact one. The character's wandering. He looks like he's stopped. He looks like he's looking at something in the distance. He's not sure if it's watching him. I can't even tell if it's a rock formation or a person, which is actually pretty cool. The line of sight, you should always have a line of sight. Remember that fog that was encircling that one guy with the spear and the torch? Well, those were lines of sight. The path he was on was a line of sight. These are all things that you're using as aids to help the viewer find the story. So invest your story on the line of sight, not just anywhere willy-nilly, just hopefully the character reads it. You don't put it out here. You don't put it on the frames of the canvas. You find an off-center, not some holy symmetry position in the middle of the canvas. You find somewhere off-center. Beautiful positioning here with this character. He's a little bit low, but it is kind of a safe environment, and it's kind of a long shot. And it's working somehow. It's not that safe because you see a mountain range and he is kind of small compared to everything else. Your values up here are a little bit off. You need a little bit more of a defined difference between the sky value and the mountain value. Unless the mountains are glowing, they should not be this value. They should be slightly darker. It is rock and grass and soil after all. But right over here, you could really just spend all of your time delaying the focus out here and kind of just expanding it down here, making sure you have a good description of the rock and the way the rock marries in with the ground. Make a little bit more sense to do with this character. Maybe he's not that visible. I mean, maybe he is. Maybe it's just one of those silhouette scenes with the guy with the hat or something like that. Just like that. But it's no longer part of the story that we're telling. Remember, it was a possibility someone might be watching them. But it's very, very successful. He kind of looks like he has a backpack on. He's just hiking and someone is watching him, and this is really freaking me out right now. I'm just sitting here watching this. I'm so like amazed right now by this. And I would love for you to explore some more. Remember that trees in the foreground, objects in the foreground are darker than objects in the background. Atmospheric fade and just the distance factor all fades objects in the distance. They overlap and they don't get detailed. Low contrast for objects in the distance, high contrast with black only, not black and white, with objects in the foreground. And then we keep the line of sight here for the most important setup for the focal point and the line of sight and all of that important stuff that tells the story. It looks like it's an overcast day, so I wouldn't worry too much about a super bright sun right there demanding our attention, because my eyes keep going there and they really shouldn't be. Stupid sun. People love having the sun in their drawings, but all it really does is just throw off your drawing. This beautiful kind of like crosshair, this setup, and this are all wonderful combination here to keep the viewer interested in watching it. And I would love to see this completed. I'd love to see this kind of evolve a little bit based on everything we covered today. Okay, and then I'm just going to go on to the next one. So, this is some really, really beautiful stuff. The story is a little bit complicated, so it's an example of a complicated story. I love the use of black. I love the abundant use of black. I love this delicate use of white. But something is happening here that is not allowing the story to come through. Something is deterring it. It's the use of this jellyfish, which feels like it's part of those little wisps, one of the wisps that were in Brave, kind of just you follow them and you find your destiny or something. So she seems like she followed it, got lost, and doesn't know what she's doing. So I'm just going to give one of these like kind of a tilted head. It's kind of just watching her, like, what are you crying about, buddy? And this character is watching her, but she doesn't know he's watching. The character it isn't really syncing with the pitch of the thumbnails, and we see all of him. This is another example of cheesy abundant light on the main character. We shouldn't be seeing all of him. He should be pretty hidden. And you feel free to make his eyes glow. Remember that in animation and storytelling, eyes always glow. Everyone has some kind of magic to them. Even if the character isn't bioluminescent or magical, their eyes will glow in the darkness. It's just part of that storytelling. It's part of that typical classic thumbnail of that quick read in the thumbnails that we see in all kinds of animation. But he doesn't seem like he's creeping. He doesn't seem like he's watching her. To have him feel like he's watching her more, maybe he's about to meet her and become friends. I would give less of a kind of active or ready to pounce kind of position in the hands. I would just do more of a kind of just watching from a safe distance, and I would dim this little guy and have a little bit more pieces here to create this beautiful line of sight to show how far she's traveled to get to her lost place. And I would have one more just around here. The brightest one should be in the foreground right beside her, and the darkest one should be in the distance. This one shouldn't be that bright. It should be as bright as kind of in between this one and this one, because you've created an anchor with which you're referencing everything. So this one is here, it's this bright. This one is this dark, so I guess this one is in between these two. It's pretty easy. You just make sure it's not brighter than this and brighter than that. Alright, so then I would use some of this light to kind of reveal her. Make sure she's not completely hidden in the shadow, and maybe she kind of just lifted her head just a little bit. And here, just let me try to sketch it instead of paint it. So she's maybe lifted her head just a little, and she's looking over there like, oh, what was that sound? Kind of like a really scared, kind of leaning away from the sound, and she's just holding onto a rock, looking in that direction, hiding anyway, maybe holding on to a rock there as well to kind of just hide a little bit and shuffle behind the rock when she sees him. That way she could, relate more to the pitch. And then now you have a clear line of sight. I would actually get rid of this one. Even though it's fun to look at, you can probably invest some fun pieces here somewhere. Maybe there's one there. Maybe she followed these exact route. She ended up here. She looked over there. He's looking at her. We look back up here, and we're kind of trapped. You always want to trap your viewer in the line of sight, in this travel, in this road of focal points. So, this is beautiful, but it's a wonderful scene. But I just don't see the story. I don't see the thing that's watching them. It'd be cool if the thing that was watching them was actually one of the trees, but we look a little closer and it's another animal, kind of. Maybe like right here we don't see his legs. We don't see his body, but we see his legs, and we kind of see two arms. So that would be really, really fun. And he's kind of just camouflaged, and they don't know what happened because he just snuck. Maybe it's a troll or something, and they're like really alert, like someone's watching us. But you do need the thing they just responded to complete the story. Just like that, and just show a little bit of a kind of, if he's an antagonist, you have to use sharp shapes for his hand. Maybe he's like has those sharp fingers, just like that, and really long nails, just like that. Or maybe super long nails, you don't know, maybe he just hunts deer, and that would have been enough to kind of tell this story. And he's kind of camouflaged in there. We don't see him right away, do we? The amount of white is okay. It's white in the distance. You've established the daytime, but they're in a dangerous part of the forest. So this is okay because the daytime is the excuse for why there's so much white. I suggest this river gets a little bit smaller and a little bit more hidden across the horizon, so it feels more flat on the earth. And just like that. It can't have equal thickness all around unless it's getting thicker proportionate to the amount of distance covered in the distance. But this is a good example of how we could benefit from these rules. The camera is still pretty level, but it's working. It's working as long as we add this fear factor here. So I would darken all these leaves, because what's happened is that we're trying to make this family of deer feel like they're trapped. And before it was too much white, they're in a silhouette, and I want it to feel like a cave, like closing up around them. So I would try that somewhere with this tree as well if I have access to it. Okay, so let's take a look at some more. This one is, again, we're seeing too much white. We're seeing the character right away. I don't know what the story is. I can't tell what the story is. You see how when you have a complicated story, that's not enough to dress it up. You know, write the complicated story till you're blue in the face. You're not going to have a believable story that is easy to access for the viewer. You're just going to have one more complicated, difficult to understand story. The more simple your story is, you can complicate it, trust me. You can complicate it with the environment, but think simple in the first time around. Think simple, because it's all about zooming out and getting a read. Think simple with the very first pitch, very first single sentence description of the story. This is really good. This is actually exactly what it's. These guys are kind of surveying the land. I don't feel like he said, shh, I heard something. He should be crouching forward and kind of having his hands all around him. So what I mean by crouching forward is legs out, hands out, head kind of shifting from side to side, kind of like telling him stop. And the other guy is like, what? Oh, I didn't hear anything. And he's just kind of holding out his spear. And he's like, oh, I heard something too. And then, of course, he reveals himself and eats them alive. This is beautiful. The line of sight is clear. The light isn't abundant. There's more shadow. Look at this friggin' gesture right here. It's so good. I really want to see some of these, you know, really rendered, pushed as far as possible. You're thinking really simplistic form study, but I invite you to apply some detail, apply some characterization. He doesn't have to be a simple, perfect creature. He can have a bit more of a scary anatomy to him in his silhouette. He can have a funny head of hair. Just a little bit more like Tarzan-like. He can have, maybe like it's an evil old witch or something like that. He can have a weapon. He can have a couple of other units here to add to his design. Nothing too crazy. Remember, it's all about him anyway. It's his gesture and his position. So I'm just going to add like a loincloth or something. These guys, of course, need detail. These pillars in the distance, these kind of like breaks in the wall need to be a bit lighter the further they get, so that they feel like they're flooded in the light. This light here is still passing through, but it's cast a shadow, so some of this character is in actually some light. It's actually visible because the light has managed to get through. It's just a single sliver, a bridge casting a shadow, so you'll still get some light on this part as long as the this beam lasts for. So if it's a circular, circular shaped beam, when it reaches the ground, you should be showing that circular shape. So I'll have a little bit more of it here, and then there's the cast shadow of that beam. Then there's more light all around the rest of the cast shadow there, and you just have to keep illuminating all of this till it gets more and more faded. And this would be the rest of the beam. And just like that. And then of course the beam itself has to be illuminated. And then you have a very complete image. You can even throw half the face in shadow and the rest kind of visible, and you can really show the teeth. And maybe this eye only glows in the dark, and so you have a chance here to detail some of this, because it's a pretty large part of the painting. And it's just glowing only in the darkness. Or you can have both glow iron giant style. It's still very, very pretty. Right, but beautiful job. I've noticed that the longer you work at a painting, or the more tries you do, the better the latest tries are. So if you are trying the same idea through 3 different attempts in the same day or week, the 3rd attempt will always be better than the last one. So every time I try to draw something, I don't really invest too much emotionally in the first time I try it, because I know I didn't really think about everything altogether. I'm too rushed trying to keep the idea from flying away. I'm trying to encapsulate and write down as much before I forget it, and then I just end up doing a really, really bad job. I try to render more than balance stage and composition and lighting. So by the time the third one comes along, I think less about the character and more about the environment, because it's a third environment around, and I ended up thinking more about environment. I started thinking more like environment mode in my visual library than character mode. It's very difficult to shake off character mode if you haven't kind of realized that yet about the study. This is what it's supposed to do, shake you off character mode for a while. This one feels like a character contemplating life. It doesn't feel like someone watching anyone. It doesn't, of course, we've covered everything today. It's a very safe, perfectly balanced environment line, horizon line. The environment seems very safe and controlled. He's just sitting there kind of with an omnipotent angle in the camera. It's not really part of him. It's not his angle. It's not over the shoulder. Over the shoulder is more intimate. If the camera is right over the shoulder of the character, it's more intimate than a very distant long shot. Shot by a helicopter. Here, this is so beautiful. The line of sight could be a little bit more described. So just always keep an eye out for roads. Roads are wonderful ways to create a line of sight. The long shadows are wonderful, but this is just very difficult to see. I love this. He could have been a little bit more easy to see. Give him a little bit more light around him. He is a POI, point of interest, so we do have to have something here, maybe a fog or some kind of indication that he is in fact dangerous. Maybe he's nice, but they're just about to meet him in a really dangerous kind of like introduction. But I would allow some of this fog to kind of sneak in here. And remember that whole thing with the spider and the guy with the torch? Well, we're combining and bridging out with the main kind of bark and then the stemming out of the line of sight. So you could have an entire composition, a line of sight that you've decided as where you're going to place everything, organized compositionally, either Fibonacci or whatever, golden ratio. And then you could have branching out additions to the line of sight. So this would be an example of a branch out. This is why we have to have something kind of just lead in here. And in the thumbnail, we're really seeing in the navigator how much we benefit from this. You can have a little bit more of them just hanging around. Maybe like a rat or something like that. Some more creatures. This little break, this little moment of positive space and a bunch of negative space looks so beautiful in a navigator. And their cast shadows should be kind of leading them, even more darker cast shadows leading them into the cave, as if they're looking for safety. That sunset is about to happen. They think it's going to be safe in here for shelter, and little do they know they're being watched by these creatures, which eventually hopefully become their friends. And then here, again, too much exposure, full realization scene. I am the dragon, kind of very, very proud. It's not at all, is he watching us? This is for sure, he's watching us. It's not at all a question of whether or not they've been seen. Absolutely been seen. I expect a lot of danger incoming. They look like they're looking at him. It's very difficult to tell that they're not looking. They're looking in a different direction. They have been seen, and they're kind of just ignoring him. This is a hurricane, a massive sound, a big creature the size of a mountain flapping its wings. I mean, everyone can hear him from miles off. Everyone can see him from miles off. So this is not something these two characters would have ignored. However, if it was more of a tiny little shape in the distance, or maybe that Slender Man character, the guy with the hat is our motif today. He's just there, kind of larger than life. Maybe it's a witch, maybe it's a group of people kind of just sneaking up on them, and they don't understand that they're in a zombie kind of marshland, and they're camouflaging with the trees, and as the viewers it's hard for us to tell. Let's give this dragon a timeout. And we end up getting a more, little easy to access storyline. They're traveling, they're small, their enemies are just as small as they are, good fit, good match, and you can just have some more, some kind of vegetation or rock structures, and it's kind of showing off as a signal that you've entered bad territory. And I'm just kind of fading off these pieces in succession. And there you go. A couple more like pines, really, really tall pines, maybe kind of looming down on them. Nothing too extreme. And now we have more of a description of a light environment. It doesn't have to be a big dragon glowing. And that way we can include, because it looks like nighttime sunset. Doesn't seem like the sky being this bright would have allowed their faces to get that dark. And then this seems very, very unfinished. Everything that we've applied today would have changed all the choices you've made. Balanced light environment, characters perfectly centered. This holy symmetry, you need to stop it, because if you constantly center everything you draw, either side, everything's perfectly centered. It'll always look like some sort of drawing of some saint. That's something they did. When they drew saints, when they drew all that stuff, they were drawing people of respect, people of glory. So they gave them this perfectly symmetrical, or not always symmetrical, sometimes three-quarter view, or really bad three-quarter view, but they always had some perfect circle behind their heads, some balance in their gesture. It was always perfectly balanced. Either side of, or either orbit of the canvas, either pole, all the poles of the canvas were evenly distributed in negative space. So you don't want to do that unless he's a holy guy and it's a story of Gilgamesh or something. Even then you want to humanize him with a more asymmetrical story, asymmetrical canvas. And I believe that's it for today. So I'll see you guys around. Bye. Thank you everyone for watching today.
Thank you.
You're very, very welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Brack.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.